Good morning, everyone. We've just started our webinar, so we are letting people filter in from the waiting room. We'll get started in just a moment. Great to see folks joining from around the world. I'm looking at folks as they filter in. We've got all of our friends from the UN NGO Working Group to End Homelessness. I see friends and colleagues from Mongolia, Wales, Canada, Italy. Great to have you all with us today. Oh, our dear colleague Vladimir from Ukraine is here. Hi, Vladimir. Vladimir is leading excellent work serving people who are in prisons in Ukraine right now. So you can imagine the difficulties Vladimir deals with on a daily basis. Great to see you all. Oh, our colleagues from Belgium are here. Wonderful. We are in the webinar view, so to all of our attendees, you won't be able to see each other, but you'll be able to see our wonderful panelists today. We're going to go ahead and get started. We are recording this webinar and it will be posted on the working group's YouTube page and website in the future, so you'll be able to watch back. My name is Lydia Stazen. I am the current chair of the United Nations NGO Working Group to End Homelessness, and I also serve as the executive director of the Institute of Global Homelessness. So it's wonderful to have you all here with us today. We have an excellent panel that came together to talk about the intersections of homelessness and data collection. All of our presenters will share for about 8 minutes, and we have lots of time at the end for questions and answers. We do have Spanish interpretation available. One of our presenters will be sharing their presentation in Spanish. So if you need interpretation between English and Spanish, you can look at the little globe at the bottom of your screen and select English interpretation or Spanish interpretation. And thank you to Martine for being with us today and providing this really important service for us. I want to say a particular thank you to Christopher Llamas, who you all can see on your screen. Christopher chaired the task force that put together this panel and some other activities of the working group during the UN's high-level political forum. So this forum is currently meeting in New York. It kicked off on Monday. It will run through the end of next week. And this is a really important forum within the United Nations. This is the time when member states are reporting their progress towards the voluntary or towards the sustainable development goals. Homelessness is not included in those goals. And so our whole aim as a working group is to highlight homelessness within the context of the United Nations, drawing more attention and action on the issue of homelessness. And so data is a really important component of that. And so our whole conversation today will be focused on the themes of data. And so we have our first presenter here from the United Nations Human Settlements Program, UN Habitat, Francesca Lionetti, who's the associate expert on housing and land. And Francesca is here with us to share a little bit more about United Nations efforts on homelessness. So Francesca, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Could you just confirm that you can see my presentation, which is going in presenter mode? Yeah.
Yes, we can see it.
Very good. Thank you. So, yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to the UN NGO Working Group to End Homelessness. My name is Francesca Lionetti, and as mentioned, I work for UN Habitat. So UN Habitat, since its foundation, has been promoting the realization of the right to adequate housing as one of the transformative forces that can lead the world to overcome challenges related to poverty, to exclusion, and to inequality. And nowhere do we see this as visible as when we approach the topic of homelessness, we feel. Homelessness is one of the most visible illustration of the threats to people's life that the lack of adequate housing can constitute. And of course, people that are experiencing homelessness also have challenges related to accessing health, to accessing education, and to access dignified living conditions. So we, as the United Nations agency that is promoting social and environmental sustainable cities for all, really believe that tackling homelessness is a precondition for the full realization of human rights, and of course, for our ability to meet Agenda 2030 targets and the SDGs. I always like to use this visual that was prepared by our host, the NGO Working Group to End Homelessness and IGH, because it really well represents different connections and linkages between homelessness and the different SDGs. As I was mentioning, UN Habitat, you probably know already, is the body within the UN system that is responsible for promoting and monitoring access to adequate housing. So we really address homelessness through this particular angle. And in the last couple of decades in particular, we have been seeing worrying signs between that connect access to housing, exclusion from housing actually, and homelessness. And this specifically on three of the main characteristics of housing. So first of all, lack of access to affordable housing is one of the major drivers of homelessness in all countries, and especially in this specific historical moment, I would like to also stress the fact that beyond rent and beyond mortgages, affordability also includes associated costs of living, so utilities, energy costs, transportation costs, or transit access. A global sample of cities already in 2018 was showing that 70% of cities of the 200 cities sampled worldwide was facing housing unaffordability. And after COVID and after the energy cost emergency, we're seeing this data getting worse. Beyond housing affordability, another issue concerns housing accessibility. So we have seen challenges for people dealing with mental or physical illness, women-headed housing, migrants and indigenous people to access adequate housing. Further, also people that are have been involved with the criminal system, for example, finally often are excluded from private housing market. Finally, on the point of tenure security, we still see evictions that are perpetuated in name of urban renewal or development, and that can lead to people losing their housing, their income, their community, and perpetuating the cycle of poverty and homelessness. Since 2019, then UN Habitat, in cooperation with other partners, including, of course, the UN NGO Working Group to End Homelessness, IGH, member states, and the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, has been working to create consensus around the structural drivers of homelessness and for the need for a definition that is internationally agreed and standardized global homelessness indicator and collection methodologies, so that we can promote strategies which are rooted in human rights, people-centered, housing-led, cross-sectoral, and evidence-based. Here you have a bit of a line, but I will just maybe speak very quickly about the expert group meeting on affordable housing and social protection system for all that was organized in 2019 together with UNDESA to inform the 58th Social Development Commission, and really aimed at deepening understanding of what were the challenges and develop a shared approach to end homelessness. During the expert group meeting, the expert recommended to devise and agreed upon a definition of homelessness which is inclusive and culturally sensitive, that is able to differentiate among degrees and types of homelessness, while also depicting homelessness as a societal failure and not one that is individual. And also, the experts also recommended to gather aggregated and, when possible, disaggregated data on specific specific drivers of homelessness and groups that are experiencing homelessness, including accounting for quantitative and qualitative differences to avoid evidence to avoid excluding those that are statistically invisible. And of course, they also recommended to continue working on addressing the root causes of homelessness through developing inclusive housing policies and strengthening social protection system, as well as targeting specific groups that are particularly vulnerable to homelessness. Many of these calls were taken up in the General Assembly resolution on inclusive policies and programs to address homelessness. That was passed in 2021. The resolution is including a description of homelessness that encompass people living on the street, people living in open spaces and in buildings that are unfit for human habitation, people who are in temporary accommodation and shelter, as well as people that live in severely inadequate housing type, where they miss, for example, social security of tenure or basic services. The resolution is also discussing the structural causes of homelessness and recognizing that it lies at the intersection with poverty, climate change, health, housing costs, and discrimination. And finally, it encouraged member states to harmonize the measurement, the collection, and the disaggregation of data on homelessness. In the last year, UN Habitat, together with UNDESA and through the support of a fantastic scientific committee and the involvement of the UN NGO Working Group to End Homelessness, has developed a report for the Secretary General to map the achievement and the challenges in the implementation of inclusive policies and programs to address homelessness. We have collected around 34 written contributions and 40 contributions through consultation, for covering a total of around 30 countries, a bit more. And among the main conclusions of the report, we actually have that while there has been a step forward toward understanding of homelessness that is driven by structural causes rather than individual choices, and this was often led by data collection, which has demystified some preconception and allowed for tailored policy. Still not enough data is collected on homelessness, and where it is collected, especially it's very geographically and regionally biased. So the methodological and knowledge advancement are not equally distributed across region, and we need to gather more knowledge and more information, especially on Central and Latin America, Asia, Africa. The lack of data not only hampers, of course, an understanding of what is the challenge, but also an understanding and an evaluation of what works. So we are seeing member states stepping up and implementing strategies and policies, but we don't often have a clear knowledge of what are the implementation steps that are needed for these approaches to work, and why do they work, where they work. So we still believe that we need some level of obligation of production of knowledge on homelessness. And in particular, we need to collect localized and nuanced data, including qualitative data. When we speak about nuanced data, we talk about like disaggregation by relevant social characteristic, for example, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, household composition, ethnicity and minority affiliation, disability status, etc. So characteristics that are specifically in relation to key aspects of homelessness that we are seeing globally. We need to support more community-led knowledge production and involvement of people with lived experiences of homelessness that should be consulted to determine the methodology for enumeration, and including also the disaggregation basis for the information collected. And we need to understand better what are the local drivers. So especially when as I talked about, like we have knowledge, but it's not globally comparable. So, and finally, of course, we need to set a global target for the eventual eradication of homelessness, aligning with the SDGs. So this could be done through integration of homelessness within multiple SDGs or with a target on its own, but we need to be better, like we need to have a target for the eradication of homelessness. This has been a request coming from many of the stakeholders consulted. So I thank you all for your attention, and I'm very happy to be here and to listen to all the experts that will be speaking after, and that will make our discussion way more grounded in the science. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Francesca. I think you noted the timeline that this takes from the expert group convening that several members of the working group were able to be part of back in 2019, the resolutions of the UN, and now this exciting sort of first ever report of the Secretary General specifically on homelessness, and how encouraging I think it is to those of us on the call today to see the strong call for data collection so we know what's working in that goal setting. Because yes, the data is important, but we also know that behind that data point is a person experiencing homelessness. And so taking that data and applying it towards action, I think is what this group gathered today hopes to see. So thank you for those comments. Next, we are going to come to Rob Robinson, one of my favorite colleagues in this work. Rob is a senior advisor for I'm missing your title here, Rob. Where is it? Partners for Dignity and Rights. And I know a huge advocate for involving people with lived experience in data. So Rob, over to you.
So thank you, Lydia, and thank you to everybody at Institute for Global Homelessness for inviting me. I appreciate the comrades from around the world joining this conversation. It's an important conversation. But I'll share with you, I think I bring a unique perspective because I have lived experience. For those of you who don't know, I spent 2.5 years homeless on the streets of Miami and 10 months in the New York City homeless shelter. And as I present my perspective, a lot of it is going to focus on New York City, which I think is in a better position than many other states in the US to collect data, but doesn't do the best job, right? And it sort of sets the tone for the country. So, many people will say New York is the financial center of the world and financial center of the country, but as New York goes, so goes the rest of the country. Well, I think with respect to data collection, I think New York does a better job than some of the other states in the country, but it could do a lot better. And let me start out by saying my background comes from something called the continuum of care, which I think Dennis will probably have the best perspective on. As a speaker, I spent 13 years in that body, and that's a specific pot of money that comes from the federal government and goes to New York City for housing plus services. So there's a certain demand to collect data that doesn't exist overall across the states. And a majority of the homeless data that could be collected is not included in that data. So give you a perspective. In New York City, data is collected from several different sources through the Department of Mental Health and Hygiene, through a general process called CARE. So there's about 4 or 5 different systems that feed into homelessness. That specialized pot of money asks for data from all of these systems to be aggregated and collected together. But there's a lot of pushback from the care providers who provide the service. And just to give you an example, because I don't want to dig too deep into this, but I'm a care provider. I'm a not-for-profit organization that works on homeless services. I have 20 programs. 2 of them are funded through the continuum of care, which makes demands to collect data through something called Homeless Management Information Systems, HMIS. The other 18, I feed data into all these different systems. And sometimes, most of the time, it's not aggregated. And the pushback comes from the not-for-profit organizations when they say, well, the federal government isn't giving me money for these 18 programs. So why do I have to answer to the demands? So I think we need laws and policies put in place to collect this data. We do have a process of collecting data, as I said, in the continuum of care called the HOPE count, Homeless Outreach Population Estimate. I do believe it is probably the best system that we have, but it has its own set of flaws. So what do I mean? Much like Francesca presented earlier, geographically, it doesn't work. So if I'm collecting data, which the government says usually happens the last week in January, in New York City, it's probably one of the coldest months of the year. In California, it's warm. In Miami, it's warm. So your data, it's sometimes is flawed, right? In New York City, I don't think the HOPE count works in January because people are disappearing. They're not going to be out on the streets. And the idea is to collect data at a certain time in a period. Anybody who's on the street obviously is homeless. But I would argue, as somebody with lived experience, that people aren't on the streets. They found a place to keep warm. And those places sometimes are inhabitable, unfit for human habitat. And we're not allowed to go down there and count those folks. When I say down there, sometimes in the subway system and other places that aren't necessarily exposed on the street. So I would argue that if we did a count in July or twice a year to sort of balance out the geographic differences, we might have a better estimate of what is truly homeless. I think the other issue when I look at New York City is we have what is called an open data portal, of which our government puts certain information regarding homelessness, regarding evictions, regarding people in shelters, but it's not in a way that's useful to the open eye. So people who might be extracting that data, you have to organize people to pull out the data and make sure that it's usable for people who are making certain arguments, like myself. I happen to work with two groups, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project and the Housing Data Coalition, which are made up of young folks with specific tech skills that can pull that data out for us and make it useful to groups that need it to make arguments on behalf of housing and homelessness. So I think, in the US, we have the means, we have the money, but we don't necessarily put those two things together to create good data and useful data. We need to do a better job of it. And then if we're going to support struggles around the world, we need to be able to share information on how that data is collected. As I said, the HOPE count can be useful around the world. It has its own set of problems, but it can be tweaked to be useful. And we have to be willing to share, which I don't think governments are always able to, or always willing to do. I want to stay back from that word able, because I believe there's a big difference in being able and willing. I think the other thing, and this is something Francesca also brought up, is the data needs to point at racial, ethnic, age, and gender specific data, because it will look different as you travel around the US. So we can have a HOPE count, and we can extend the HOPE count and make it nationwide, and probably have the federal government institute a policy that will force us to collect it. But to be useful, it has to have be pointing at those specific issues. So racially, ethnically, age, gender, there are other factors, urban versus rural. So there are a lot of things that feed into this in the US. But overall, I think we need to do a better job at data collection. We have the means, but we don't necessarily have the political will to do it. And that's part of the argument why I like to work with groups around the world and sort of challenge the US government. I think we all know in this group, Finland has been doing a great job. I challenge New York City government at high levels to look at Finland, to understand Finland, to study Finland. But there's a little bit of a reluctance, because I think there is an exceptionalism that exists in the US that says, we do it better than anybody else. Why do we have to look at the rest of the world? And that needs to change. So I'll stop there. I'm here for questions, and I'll be here through the remainder of the presentation. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Rob. We so much appreciate your perspective as a person with the lived experience of homelessness and your deep expertise on data and your involvement there. I think a couple of really interesting things that you brought out, that the data can be flawed, and we need to always be working to make it better quality data and more useful data, and that countries, I'm a US citizen as well, countries that have the means to do it have a greater responsibility to do so. So thank you for those comments. We'll now pop up to Canada, Dr. Jayne Malenfant. Jayne is the Associate Professor of Education at McGill University and another wonderful colleague and advocate in this work. So Jayne, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lydia. Yeah, I could also just listen to Rob for a while longer. Hopefully I'll be adding, I think, directly to what we've both have been sharing. I'm from Kapuskasing, Ontario, up here in Canada, but I'm now living and working in Tiohtià:ke, or what is colonially known as Montreal, where I do work at McGill University. And I'm a researcher who works both within and outside of institutions to think about addressing homelessness, but really working on that end of, if we're going to be thinking about data and including communities who are most impacted by housing insecurity, how do we do that? How do we do that well? And how do we navigate what already exists in terms of how we're collecting data, how we're thinking of data, and who's using that data? I really work to emphasize what people are already doing to try to think of how data can support existing initiatives towards housing justice, and thinking of actually the role that the right kinds of knowledge that we can bring in can contribute to those efforts and shift policy responses. I'm also someone who has previous lived experience of housing precarity and now really works to support people with lived and living experiences to be involved in policy processes, involved in research, involved in advocacy, and really grounding everything in a nothing about us without us, which I think as an ethos is not always something that has historically sat with how data has been collected, stored, analyzed, used, understood. And so a lot of what I'm sharing today is learnings from working with other people who have been doing this work for a while, and who have firsthand knowledge not only of maybe doing research in their communities or understanding data in their communities, but also firsthand knowledge of being the subject of data extraction in different institutional and even academic settings. I really think that data is something we need, ongoing knowledge of what is happening. So similarly, this is necessary to shape our responses to homelessness, to ensure what we're doing is grounded in what is actually happening today and responding to that. I think a lot of the work that I do in spaces where it's lived experience led and community led, there's a resistance to data just off the bat, a resistance to data collection especially. People have often had their data collected in harmful ways through a lot of their lives, whether that's within institutionalized settings, but also people will say things like, well, we already know what the problems are. And so if I come in as a researcher, even as a researcher who has lived experience and has been doing community organizing, that is a response I hear again and again. And I think that it's true in some cases, for sure. We do know what some of the issues are. We know some issues around what is driving housing crises. But I think beginning in what we know in our communities, what we're seeing in terms of insufficiencies in assuring housing rights, that's a starting point. And so we can honor that and say, yes, people know what is happening, but then the right structures, the right training, the right tools, and ultimately, I think the right data can continue to shape those knowledges to create more effective actions and interventions. But I also am really interested, and Rob, you talked a little bit about this, in building capacity in communities to gather their own data, own their own data, mobilize their own data for the aims that they want to. But at the same time, I think it's actually really important that we're heeding those resistances in communities, the fears that people have of their data being extracted and abstracted, and maybe manipulated in ways where they don't recognize it anymore, or they're not even seeing what is being done with it anymore. And so particularly within some communities I'm working with, so for example, right now I'm working with communities of trans, gender diverse, non-binary, two-spirit folks here up in Canada. And this is a group that is explicitly shared that they feel over-researched. And so data has been extracted, again, in institutions, but also through academic projects, and it's not being understood in the ways they need it to. It's not being used in service of their right to housing. And so this has been explicit in a lot of discussions I've been having. This is also the case with young people who are exiting the care system into homelessness, where they're saying, you know, so much data has been often collected on me throughout my life. What has happened to it? Who is taking it, and why can't I access it? And so I think while we're having this discussion, talking about gathering data, who is gathering it, who has access to it, why are we gathering it? Is it just for data's sake? What are the actions that are coming out of the collection of the data that we have? Another point that Rob brought up too is data telling the whole story. Are we saying this is what's happening while we're missing important aspects? And I think this is also part of why that community knowledge and lived experience engaging with data is really important, because I've seen from work in my own communities time and again, data being presented in a way that I know it's missing important pieces of the puzzle in how homelessness is being experienced. And so as those pieces are missing, we're missing points of possible intervention. And so those knowledges, and maybe that's qualitative data, but I think also engagement of people who are directly impacted by housing rights violations in analysis, and engagement with the data themselves being undertaken by those who are impacted. So yeah, we want people consulting who have lived experience, but why not have people who have that firsthand experience also being trained to work with data themselves? I think that's a really fruitful place of potential change, where we can be fighting that abstraction of data and getting a better picture of what our data is telling us about what's going on. I think there's also a belief that if we just get the right data, things will change. So if we show, okay, this statistic demonstrates this thing, if we're speaking to, you know, governments, if we're speaking to different institutions, different decision-making bodies, if we just demonstrate that the system is unjust, or if we just demonstrate that something isn't working well, that is enough. And I think that's also, it could be important, and that's why data is an important thing to be paying attention to. But again, it's not the final step, it's maybe a first step. And so systems that organize these injustices, that actually contribute to the data that we're seeing that is unjust around homelessness, are not going to change just because we're saying, look, here's a number. And so I think for me, moving forward in my own work of trying to understand how we can make data useful, getting rid of assumptions and breaking down barriers for accessing and understanding data. So even if people aren't directly collecting or analyzing data, can you ensure that people in community are able to understand the data that's being collected about them and use it for their own aims? So this might be training, supports, and education on how to read, collect, understand data in ways that are useful. But something promising that I also see is ally researchers and others who are working with data in service of communities that are most impacted by housing injustice. And so that might be also some of us who are here today, listening to what data people need. So I can think of one example here in Montreal. It's a community-based action research network in Park Extension, which is a particular neighborhood that's facing a lot of displacement. And so researchers coming in theoretically are meeting with community members to say, actually, we do need some data on this thing. Can you collect it and then help us mobilize it? And so in that way, data is being collected in conversation with those who are impacted by being pushed out of this neighborhood in order to support their housing stability. I think ultimately having data in itself is not inherently transformative, but it is a really important tool. And so I think we just need to be thinking, you know, do the ways that we're collecting data, are they harmful? Are they justified in the harm that they have? Because I think that's also something. I've done projects where we are collecting data in ways that can be traumatizing to people, but those people are game and they're saying, if you can do something with this data, I will share my knowledge with you. And so I think just always coming into this with reflexivity and not taking for granted that data in itself is going to change things, but that it's one of many tools we have to address housing rights violations and homelessness.
Thank you, Dr. Malenfant. I had to stop taking notes about like key things to recap, because everything that you said was so on point. And I think, you know, bringing a really sort of human-centered thinking into our data collection and making sure that we are working with people from whom we're extracting data to take action on it. And I saw our friend Jim Claffey from the working group said, maybe we need no data collection without using it to solve the issue. And I know that that is the spirit of the working group, that we recognize the importance of data for action. Okay, we now are going to travel down to Uruguay. Our colleague Gabriel Cunha, who is the director of the Coordination Division of Programs for Homeless People. He works in the Ministry of Social Development in Uruguay and has been a dear colleague of ours. Gabriel will be presenting in Spanish, so if you need translation, please select the English or Spanish channel using the globe function at the bottom of your screen. We'll give everybody a second to do that. And okay, Gabriel, over to you.
Bien, no me está permitiendo compartir la pantalla.
Let me. Okay, you can try now, Gabriel.
Tienen la presentación igual en tu mail, Lidia, si quieren hacerlo desde ahí.
Great.
Genial.
I have it. 1 second.
And I shared it, Lydia.
Oh, great. All set.
Ok, genial, gracias. Bueno, pasamos a la primera diapositiva. Primero que nada, es un honor poder estar en esta instancia. Personalmente, a mí me toca estar ahora desde el lado del gobierno y en lo que es la dirección de los programas para personas en situación de calle, pero en realidad vengo de la sociedad civil. Durante toda mi vida trabajé desde ese lugar, entonces también escuchar todo lo que vienen planteando los colegas en otras partes del mundo trabajando desde ese lugar me reconforta muchísimo, y también al ver el tópico puntual del que estamos hablando, obviamente que genera mucho sentido de responsabilidad el poder defender un tema que yo creo que es central a la hora de poder abordar la problemática del sinhogarismo, y sobre todo entender cómo esta problemática atraviesa cada una de las sociedades en las que integramos, como es la recolección de datos, y la recolección de datos enfocada en tratar de tener objetivos ambiciosos como es la erradicación del sinhogarismo. Y algo que decía Jayne recién me parece muy acertado y que creo que debe ser una de las banderas que levantemos a la hora de pensar y de defender lo importante de la recolección de datos, que es los datos como herramienta a la hora de tomar decisiones. Y creo que desde el punto de vista de los gobiernos hay una responsabilidad enorme a la hora de poder tener datos certeros y datos que brinden nociones claras de ciertas situaciones y puedan ejemplificar lo que están atravesando distintos grupos, distintas subpoblaciones que componen el sinhogarismo en cada sociedad, a la hora de recolectarlo, tener ese horizonte claro. Primero, un pequeño comentario sobre este primer slide, es que en Uruguay ha habido una cultura de tratar de tener información acerca de esta problemática. Yo sé que tenemos un pequeño obstáculo con el idioma, pero acá les comento brevemente qué es este primer cuadro. Desde el 2006 hasta la actualidad se han hecho distintos tipos de mediciones en Uruguay, que han ido desde conteos de personas en situación de calle y conteo de personas que han estado en intemperie, durmiendo en intemperie, personas que han estado en centros. Se ha hecho caracterización específica de personas que estaban en centros, pero hay un mojón hay un momento clave en el año 2020, donde nosotros hicimos una medición completa en la cual tomamos varios puntos, desde el conteo de personas. En una noche hicimos un conteo de las personas que dormían en intemperie y que estaban durmiendo en centros, tanto en todo el territorio nacional, pero también sumamos a eso el poder hacer una caracterización de población en intemperie y en centros. Eso fue en el año 2020 y pudimos tener una foto del día, de un momento preciso, teniendo información cuantitativa y cualitativa de nuestra población en situación de calle. Algo que es importante es que también esto mismo vamos a hacerlo en un par de semanas. Vamos a contar con la visita de Julia y Lidia por el IGH, y vamos a volver a hacer lo mismo. Ahora les voy a mostrar algunos datos que se desprendieron de esta medición. Próxima slide, por favor. Algunas de las cosas más importantes que para nosotros, y en esto de que son herramientas para la toma de decisiones, es importante. A mí, cuando hablamos con los equipos de trabajo, tratamos de incorporar un concepto, y muchas veces hablamos de la situación de calle, y recién Rob lo decía, y también lo decía Jayne, que hay distintos grupos, y hay que poder poner énfasis específico en distintos grupos. Nosotros con los equipos de trabajo hablamos de las subpoblaciones que componen la población en situación de calle. Acá algunos datos importantes. Logramos, este cuadro que tenemos acá habla acerca de los motivos que las personas declaraban que los habían llevado a estar en situación de calle. Y obviamente esto es un dato autodeclarado que puede tener subrelevamiento en algunos ítems específicos, pero habla muy bien acerca de la percepción que han tenido las personas de la temática que los ha llevado a estar en situación de calle. Y los tres más importantes han sido la ruptura de vínculos, que la ruptura de vínculos generalmente, lo sabemos todos, está asociada con un montón de otras situaciones, pero el segundo y el tercer punto han sido los ingresos, la falta de ingresos, la falta de trabajo y la problemática de adicciones. Obviamente la problemática de adicciones tiene muchísimo que ver con lo que es la ruptura de vínculos también, pero nos dan una noción acerca de cuáles son la percepción que tiene la población en situación de calle, por la cual terminaron en esa situación. Tenemos otros ítems como ser víctimas de violencia, patologías psiquiátricas, salidas de privación de libertad, pérdida de vivienda, pérdidas de un familiar, serían el resto de los ítems que aparecen acá. Próxima slide, por favor. Lo mismo nos pasa cuando visualizamos acá, verán que hay tres columnas. La columna verde es personas que están en centros, la amarilla es intemperie en la capital del país y la rosa es intemperie en el interior del país. Acá nos parece importantísimo algunos elementos. El 90% de la población se centra entre 22 y 64 años, en las tres filas que están destacadas con la flecha. Pero si vamos a los centros, tenemos casi un 53% de personas que están entre 41 y 64 años, lo que habla de una cronificación a la participación de centros de un cierto extracto etario. Y por otro lado, cuando vamos a intemperie, vemos que eso tiende a ir hacia una parte, un extracto poblacional más joven. Destaco estos puntos porque son importantes para lo que viene después, que son las definiciones que tomamos en base a esta información. Próxima slide, por favor. Las columnas siguen siendo las mismas siempre. El verde es refugio, o es centros. El el amarillo es intemperie en Montevideo, en la capital del país, y el rosa es intemperie en el interior. Acá un dato importante también que habla acerca de la identidad de género autodeclarada por las personas. Hay una realidad en Uruguay, y es que la problemática de situación de calle está muy masculinizada. En los refugios, los hombres rondan en el 80%, pero cuando vamos a intemperie, más del 90% en general son hombres. Próxima slide, por favor. Este es un dato también no menor. De vuelta, las columnas tienen el mismo significado que veníamos hablando. Acá hablábamos tomamos el dato acerca de cómo declaraban las personas, declaraban tener cierto tipo de ingresos, y a nosotros es un dato que también nos resulta importante, no por el hecho de no consideramos obviamente que tengan los recursos suficientes para poder sostenerse, pero sí nos da una noción bastante importante de la necesidad y la demanda que tenían las personas de tener alguna fuente de ingreso asociada con tareas realizadas, o sea, acceso al trabajo. Porque considerábamos, y es un tema sobre el que hemos trabajado bastante, es que muchos de los reclamos que hay es por falta de oportunidades. Entonces era un dato no menor para poder pensar en eso más adelante. Próxima slide, por favor. En esa línea, tomando en cuenta toda esta información, es que nosotros tomamos una serie de definiciones. Primero, basados en esto que hablábamos hace un minuto, de que los datos terminan siendo una herramienta y deben ser orientados hacia ese lugar. Ahora toda esta información que acabamos de hablar viene de una medición como el censo, que tiene un componente muy fuerte desde el punto de vista cuantitativo, pero obviamente nos ha dado elementos cualitativos, pero no es la única medición que hemos hecho. También hicimos una etnografía de una de las respuestas de housing específicas que comenzamos a dar en el año 2020, que también nos ayudó a tener una caracterización del comportamiento del grupo humano que se conformaba en ese lugar, y sobre todo el cómo poder entender las distintas lógicas que se daban en la población. Pero a nosotros toda esta información, todo este acumulado de información, nos llevó a poder consolidar algunas percepciones que uno tiene al trabajar con esta población, obviamente, pero tener datos concretos te dan herramientas muy sustentables para conseguir recursos, para poder tomar decisiones hacia adelante. Y una de las primeras decisiones es: debíamos reducir el peso porcentual de las respuestas nocturnas en favor de respuestas 24 horas. No perdamos, acá en Uruguay tenemos en el 2019, 2020, que fue en el momento de la pandemia, teníamos un peso porcentual de las respuestas nocturnas de casi el 85%, o sea, el 85% de respuestas que había para personas solas en situación de calle estaban respuestas nocturnas. Eso obviamente llevaba a que los refugios nocturnos acá en Uruguay funcionan. La persona puede entrar a las 6 de la tarde y a las 9 de la mañana debía retirarse. Durante un gran lapso del día, esa persona estaba en la misma situación de calle que estaba aquel que estaba en intemperie, que no accedía a ninguno de nuestros centros. Nosotros hemos ido cambiando esa lógica y generando muchos centros 24 horas, al punto que al día de hoy, más allá de que creció la capacidad de respuesta casi el doble, hemos logrado que el peso porcentual de los refugios nocturnos en la respuesta para personas solas se redujera a menos del 50%. Segundo, y a la hora de tener esta información específica, a nosotros puntualmente, y pasa muchas veces cuando hablamos de las temáticas relacionadas a población vulnerable, y dicen, bueno, acá en Uruguay pasaba que decían es del Ministerio de Desarrollo Social, se tiene que ocupar el Ministerio de Desarrollo Social. Al tener esta información, específica, hablando de poblaciones específicas, nosotros logramos algo que fue poder sentar en la mesa de discusión a otras instituciones, como ser el Ministerio de Salud Pública, el Ministerio de Vivienda, la Junta Nacional de Drogas, poder sentar en la mesa a otros actores en los que con esta información podíamos decirle, miren, este problema sí, obviamente hoy está en la órbita de la situación de calle, pero viene de una trayectoria de vida que estuvo atravesada de un montón de situaciones que hubo un montón de fallas en distintos momentos o de falta de abordajes que llevaron a esta persona en este lugar. Entonces, tener información nos permitió sentar en la mesa a otros actores y generar de esa manera abordajes interinstitucionales para la atención de esta temática. Y por otro lado, también, y también por un poco la trayectoria de vida que hemos tenido muchas de las personas que hoy en día estamos trabajando esta temática desde el lado del gobierno, logramos algo que es importante, que es, nosotros tenemos como en Uruguay un Estado muy garantista, muy fuerte, muy presente, pero también que eso tiene cosas muy positivas, porque asume la responsabilidad de estar de varias tareas, pero muchas veces cercenaba la posibilidad de que la sociedad civil también tuviera un peso. Y bueno, una de las cosas más importantes que hemos logrado en este último tiempo es generar nexos en esto de coordinar no solamente con actores, con otras instituciones públicas, sino con la sociedad civil, con privados, a la hora de poder generar abordajes interinstitucionales e intersectoriales. Próxima slide, por favor. En esa línea, acá algunos de los ejemplos de nuevos proyectos que hemos generado en estos últimos años. Con esto, con una lógica de diversificación de las respuestas. Y es una de las cosas que nosotros sostenemos como más importante a la hora de abordar la problemática de situación de calle, en base a tener información clara de las distintas subpoblaciones y las distintas temáticas que llevan a la persona a estar en situación de calle, es que nosotros nos hemos centrado en una línea programática que es la diversificación de las respuestas. En esa línea hemos generado proyectos de housing, un programa que instauramos en el año 2021 que se llama Viviendas con Apoyo, que básicamente trabaja en una lógica de housing first y housing led para poder brindar respuestas a la población. Generamos un proyecto de vales de inclusión sociohabitacional, donde a personas que su temática era coyuntural y caían en situación de calle por un tema de falta de ingreso específico en ese momento, nosotros le estamos subsidiando el pago de una solución habitacional por 3 meses, con la capacidad de una renovación a 6 meses, y de esa manera es una suerte de prevención secundaria para que la persona no ingrese a estar en situación de calle. Hoy estamos pagando subsidios en residenciales para adultos mayores, subsidios en centros de rehabilitación, que eso es algo histórico. Nosotros ahora, más allá de generar centros estatales, lo que estamos haciendo es encontrar centros privados y subsidiarles la rehabilitación a personas que tienen consumo problemático. Generamos centros de atención específicos para migrantes, dispositivos específicos para el ingreso de mujeres con niños, niñas y adolescentes que quedan en situación de calle. Ahí hay algo importante en Uruguay, no tenemos niños en situación de calle. Siempre que se encuentra una situación se actúa de manera inmediata y la persona coyunturalmente podrá aparecer en situación de calle, pero enseguida se actúa por parte del Estado. Generamos algo que llamamos Centro de Primera Atención a Personas en Intemperie, que es un lugar enfocado específicamente a trabajar en el núcleo duro de personas que pernoctan en intemperie, que no han adherido a ningún tipo de respuesta. Centros de cuidados especiales para personas con deterioro físico, cognitivo. Hemos generado proyectos de trabajo protegido, y algo que para nosotros fue muy importante, que al final del año pasado generamos algo posterior a una actividad que tuvimos con el IGH. Nosotros vinimos con la idea de hacer un llamado a proyectos de innovación social, en el cual abrimos la oportunidad a que organizaciones de la sociedad civil presentaran propuestas y desde el Estado las financiáramos. Y estamos en este momento en el proceso de implementación de varios de esos proyectos. Y ahí contamos con la ayuda del IGH también para todo ese proceso. Próxima slide. Esta es una gráfica que obviamente no muestra mucho, pero es importantísimo ver el quiebre que existe entre el 2019 y el 2020, que es cuando iniciamos ese proceso de diversificación. Estas tres líneas, la línea naranja, la de más abajo, es la de personas en intemperie. La línea del medio, el azul, es la de las personas en centros de atención, y la línea gris, la de más arriba, es la de la población total. Entre el 2016 y el 2019 venían acompasado el crecimiento de la población en situación de calle, la población en situación de calle, tanto en intemperies como en refugio, venía parejo. Es más, si ustedes lo ven, ahí se visualiza que era mayor el aumento de población en intemperie que de población que aceptaba o daría algún tipo de respuesta. En el momento ese de quiebre entre el 2019 y 2020, que iniciamos el proceso de diversificación, nosotros logramos disociar el crecimiento de la población, que sabemos que hay un crecimiento de demanda de la población total en situación de calle, lo logramos disociar de las personas que terminan estando en intemperie, que terminan estando pernoctando en intemperie. Y eso consideramos que es a causa de que en la medida que logramos diversificar, que logramos brindar respuestas específicas, logramos generar una mayor adhesión por parte de las personas a las propuestas, y logramos de esa manera también poder atender una población que en otros momentos seguramente era imposible atenderla. Entonces, para nosotros, obviamente esta información que hemos dado acá es muy escasa para lo que se pueda. Quedamos abiertos si en algún momento quieren profundizar, si alguien quiere profundizar alguno de los temas, pero para nosotros ha sido importante visualizar que con este proceso de diversificación logramos reducir la prevalencia en intemperie y logramos generar mayor adhesión. Que ahí genera muchas cosas. Tendés a ser, cuando tú tenés respuestas diversificadas y específicas, tendés a ser más eficiente desde la inversión y desde la intervención, que para nosotros es importantísimo. Última slide. En la última slide yo dejo mis datos. Si alguien quiere algo más de información o lo que sea, quedo a las órdenes. Muchas gracias por escucharme y por la instancia.
Thank you, Gabriel. I appreciate your perspective as someone working within the government, but also having the civil society background, and your point that data is a tool for decision-making. Some very interesting comments in the chat pointing out that the masculinization of homelessness may be that our data does not tell the whole story, that we need to think about hidden forms of homelessness, and that more impact women and girls and children more than sort of people who are street homeless or living in the shelters. So encourage you to check out those comments in the chat. Over to South Africa, our colleague, Dr. Lutendo Malisha, who works for Statistics South Africa and is responsible for data collection on homelessness. We're running a little bit over time, but we will still have lots of time for questions and answers. So Dr. Malisha.
Thank you very much. I just want to also thank the organizers for the opportunity for me to come and present in this forum. I will be focusing mostly on data collection strategies we use here in South Africa. And I also should acknowledge that I think in terms of the region in general, as a Southern African region, we really have practically limited information when it comes to homeless data. And I think as a region, we have a long way to go. I don't know why I'm not able to move my slide. Okay, I managed to move my slides. Thank you. So in terms of South African context, I should also acknowledge the fact that we only have one source at a national level wherein we can look into information or data collected from the homeless population, and this is only based from the census collected. Yes, South Africa has a very long history when it comes to data collection. I think we're one of the countries that has collected data in general on people for the longest time. However, we do not have that data, that long history of homeless data. And homeless data, I think, I would say it's fairly a new, it's in the past for the longest time. However, some of those censuses, of course, they were collected during the apartheid regime, and they were not meant to represent everybody in the country. So therefore, those ones are generally deemed ratted and unreliable. However, after South Africa got its democracy, there were new censuses, new laws that were regulating statistics. And Statistics Act of 6 of 1999 is one that guides and gives mandate to Statistics South Africa to collect information from population in general, so that the information is available, policymakers can make use of it. And of course, when it comes to censuses and the collection of homeless population, we are guided by international policies and programs. Of course, the right of adequate housing for, it's the basic right for every human being. South African Constitution also does accommodate or gives a way that policymakers should, where they can start from. So because it talks about the right to access to adequate housing, what we mean by adequate housing. So if somebody is homeless, obviously they do not have adequate housing. We do have a number of some policies, not a number, some policies that look into the government ensuring that there is decent homes for the population, because based on our history as a country, we've had people who were displaced, removed from their homes. There's a long way in which they're ensuring that people are, getting settled and getting some houses. So as Statistics South Africa, we are responsible for ensuring that we collect such data and making it available. So after South Africa got its democracy, we've had a few censuses collected. We've had the first census collected in 1996. We've had the second one, 2001. So you can see the difference between those two is 5 years period. And those were done using paper-based, it was a pen and a pencil. Our field workers had to go to people's houses and collect information face-to-face. But then due to, as we are a low-income country, we couldn't afford a 5-year period census. So then there has to be changes. So censuses were then changed to a 10-year period. So from 2001, we had the next one was 2011, and then 2011, we were supposed to have another one in 2021. Unfortunately, because of COVID, that did not happen, but we managed to collect in 2022. So the 2022 census is the only census that was now at a digital level, wherein we collected it using KP and all these other computer-assisted methods, Kawi, Kati, and sending emails to people. So those are some of the things. And then, of course, our censuses are de facto. We collect information from based on where people were on the census night. So that's why we are using the word de facto. So I should also just give information here. So in terms of homeless data, unfortunately in 1996, because it was, I think I would call it a learning census, wherein the concern was to ensure that the government has collected more of a representative number of people in the country based on our past. So they wanted to ensure that everybody else is counted. However, there was, I think, a mistake in terms of there was no focus in terms of collecting information from the homeless. So the homeless were not at all targeted with that census. So there is no information on that census at all. But in 2001, then I think based on the reviews, based on the stakeholders that we work with, there was now a consideration, and then there was an instrument that was then dedicated into collecting homeless population. As we can see, I've mentioned in questionnaire B, since that census had quite 3 questionnaires. So we had questionnaire A, which only collected information from the households, but then we had questionnaire B, which collected information from the people who were homeless. And then we also had questionnaire C, which also were meant to target or collect information from a homeless population, but those who are in shelters. So those are the instruments that we used. And as I've mentioned earlier, these were done at a face-to-face method wherein people had to go and collect information. And in terms of how this was done, questionnaire B and C of the census 2001 were meant to only be collected on one night. So it's a once-off and only 1 day data collection. And
Oh, Lutendo, we lost your sound. We can't hear you. No. Not yet. I think maybe we can switch to Dennis's presentation and then come back to you while you work on your sound. Let's do that.
All right, thanks, Lydia. My name is Dennis Culhane. I'm a professor of social policy at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm one of the co-principal investigators for an effort that's done annually in the United States called the Annual Homelessness Assessment Report to the Congress. We effectively roll up all the local counts that are conducted across the United States. And there are 2 ways that we measure. Well, first, let me state that our definition of homelessness from our federal housing agency is people who are in shelters or temporary housing, or people who are living unsheltered in places not meant for human habitation. It does not include some of the so-called hidden homeless groups, people who are in crowded housing or in substandard housing. And those are obviously considerably larger populations, which our federal census does count those people. Now, with respect to the federal homeless counts that we undertake, as Rob mentioned, we have a system in place, and it's locally, these systems are administered and managed on a local level called Homeless Management Information System. And that is intended to track people who are entering and exiting emergency shelter, transitional housing, or even our permanent housing programs. In some cases, communities are also using this system to track street outreach contacts. So that does pick up some people who are unsheltered, but again, the coverage of those is going to be uneven and certainly not comprehensive. In any event, the most recent annual count in the United States of shelter users was about 1.4 million people in the United States across the year 2021. Now, the advantage of having this client level data system is that it does enable communities to do further in-depth analysis in terms of race, sex, and age, duration, looking at entries and exits, for example, as well as people who are returning to homelessness who might have left through some program. So we can see whether or not certain programs are associated with returns to homelessness or not, or certain types of exits. Another advantage is that because these records do have identifiers on them, you can conceal those identifiers through encryption methods, but it does enable you to link these records to other systems, which most importantly in the US has included Medicaid records, which are records that track hospitalizations, use of emergency rooms, also jail records, and any other myriad sources of information across education, health, and human services. So this has enabled a whole new vast amount of research that's undertaken. I estimate that at least a third of the published research now coming out of the United States is based on some analysis of these HMIS data, typically linked with some of these other data sources. So that's another advantage. More widely known, however, to the general public is our point in time count. We use the acronym a PIT count. It's a one-night count. Communities are supposed to conduct this in the last week of January. It involves both counting the people in shelters, which is actually pretty easy because occupied beds are known through this HMIS system. You can just run a report of who is in those beds on that day. But the most important reason we do this point in time count is because we don't have a good way of measuring the unsheltered population. And the only way that can be done is by deploying people out onto the streets to undertake these counts. Now, we have 3 approved methods for communities to do this. One is what's called a hotspot analysis, which is to identify those places where it is known that there are more than 2 people who are homeless in those locations. And those places are all counted by workers. But they may not go beyond the hotspots. They might just do, in some cases, for example, this would include encampments and such. A second method is hotspots plus a sample of a sample of what we call census block groups that are stratified with regard to whether there's a high, medium, or low probability of finding people who are homeless there. And generally, the places that are low probability don't get sampled because the likelihood of finding people there is so low. The medium sites where there's a moderate probability of counting people, those are the ones that might get sampled, maybe a 10% sample or even a 20% sample, and workers are deployed to go and count those. And then all of the hotspot, all the places that have a high probability of finding people, usually those are all counted, any area that's included in that. Now, our last one-night count, our PIT count, was around 550,000 here in the United States. I will note, by the way, that the annual shelter use has been declining since the pandemic. Partly that may be because of the way we reorganize some shelters using hotels and motels for people who are at high risk for bad COVID outcomes. And the PIT count had been trending down from 2010 to 2017, but that has reversed as the unsheltered homeless problem on the West Coast of the United States has overtaken the gains that have been made in other parts of the country, as well as New York City, especially. We know this year with the migrant population coming into the general shelter system has driven up dramatically the number of people sheltered in New York City. Lastly, I'll just note what is not included in either of these counts. As I mentioned already, people who are doubled up living in substandard housing, they are not included. So this sort of hidden homeless population that some describe. Migrant shelters typically are not included. They are administered by a separate federal agency. Most of them are close to the US-Mexico border, but those are administered, paid for by a separate entity. They're not included. Disaster relief shelters are also administered by another federal agency, FEMA. And so those are also generally not included in the homeless count. And so that's basically how we do it here in the United States, and glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Culhane. I think your points around needing multiple methodologies to collect the data and being aware of the gaps. I come back to what Dr. Malenfant said, is our data telling the whole story? And you showed clearly how some of our data shows a good part of the story, but probably not the whole story. Lutendo, is your sound back?
I believe so.
Okay, great. We'll give you like 4 minutes. I know it's a more abbreviated time, but we want to make sure we've got time for questions and answers. So back to you, Lutendo. Thank you.
I'll definitely give a summary. So I just wanted to finish we have collected information from the 2001 census. We've also collected information on homelessness in the 2011. Though there's been, each year we've seen improvements in terms of instruments being improved, changes also in terms of methodologies of approaching. However, for 2001 and 2011 censuses, I think there were similar things in terms of the way those in the institutions were collected, and also in those ones who were roofless were collected. And we only visited the areas or the hotspots from 12 midnight, and the data collection process was only allocated 3 hours, which was 12 to 3, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So until then the data collection for homeless would then be stopped. Of course, then this was reviewed and we met with a number of our stakeholders to improve and see what is really, what can we do better? Obviously, because we are still learning and improving our methodology. And for Census 2022, we had a number of recommendations and in ways in which we could collect, and that was then implemented into our Census 2022 instrument. And we still collected, we started our data collection at 9 p.m. because people said 12 midnight is way too late, you're waking people up. So our stakeholders then recommended that we should start around 9 p.m. and then we shouldn't stop, because the idea of the previous censuses was people had to stop at the time at which was suggested, and now is you only stop counting until all the hotspots were now finished. So unfortunately, the results are not yet out, but we've seen that as we improve our methods and approaches, we've been able to cover a large number of areas. We've been able to visit and identify a number of hotspots. So this has shown, we see it in terms of saying we've collected a large number of homeless. We saw that difference between 2001 and 2011. And we hope, and we're still waiting for the results for 2022 and see how that has yet changed. And I think in summary, those are the methods, and that's so far what we've done. But just to speak, we've seen also that there's been a large interest in our municipalities and especially cities and metros. And we're starting to see that there's been cities and metros that are now starting to collect data for themselves. So because, census data has been, because it takes long and these people's lives change all the time. We don't know what happened during COVID. If data was collected during that time, maybe we would have seen a different kind of scenario. So the idea is to see frequent data. So we are aware and we hope to do better. We can see what Uruguay is doing, collecting every year, and that is very much impressive. So thank you. And if there's any question, I am willing to share further and more detailed information about the methodologies that we use. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Malisha. So one of the reasons that we wanted you to come in and present was to show the difference in context and what you're able to do when there is a very different resource base at your disposal. So having the census every 10 years is still an important piece of information that you have, and you have the aims to do it more frequently, but you do have that kind of baseline measure. So okay, we have time for questions and answers. If people want to put their questions there, you can put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, or you can put it into the chat. We have a couple that have come in. The first one is from Abdullahi Osman, and they ask, how do we involve people with lived experience and their perspectives on a regular basis without causing engagement fatigue and re-traumatizing individuals? I'm going to send this one over to Rob first.
Thank you, Lydia. I am happy to answer this question because we formed a group in New York City, and I shouldn't say we. I talked about in my presentation about political will and a will to do things differently than they've been done in the past. New York City employed, or our mayor appointed somebody named Jessica Katz as chief housing officer once he got elected. So in January 2022, Jessica Katz took the role of chief housing officer, overseeing New York City's 2 chief housing agencies. Jessica, a personal friend of mine, reached out to me, and I'm going to share some intimate information, and said, I want to bring people with lived experience, Rob, to the table to have real conversations. Send me some names. You know who they are. I sent her an email of 26 names. They were the usual suspects. And by that, I mean advocates that always had access to government at different levels. She sent me back a very tersely worded email saying, Rob, I don't want the usual suspects. I want people like yourself with lived experience. Send me the names. I sent her the names. Make a long story short, we started meeting with the mayor and the 2 housing officers on a regular monthly basis to shape New York City's housing blueprint going forward. In the past, all the mayoral administrations had handled homelessness and housing separately, which was a mistake because you're homeless because you don't have housing. And Jessica came up with this novel idea to create a report called a Blueprint on Housing and Homelessness put together, right? So I give her a lot of credit on that. She has formalized this group. She has stepped down. I'll be honest with you, she's stepped down. And this is some of the challenges of government, particularly the complications when governments disagree. She stepped down for the position, but before she stepped down, she instituted by a decree that this group of lived experience people will have a voice in how housing happens in New York City going forward. The only way that this group can be pushed out is by mayoral executive order. Which mayor is going to sign off on saying, I don't want these people involved, right? So it's something she can hang her hat on, but she was very real about it. Now, Abdullah asked a question about sharing his stories. I think we heard the stories once or twice. And Abdullah, I'll be honest with you, I was homeless 18 years ago. But the more I tell my story, the more I see people step up to the plate to share theirs. And then that's another way of collecting data, right? Because if all these people are telling a similar story, then there's some trend, there's some issue that is happening that we need to address. So I think there are ways, and I think we have to have people that are open within government to these new ideas. The way we've done it in the past didn't work, and New York City is perfect proof of it, folks. When I came into advocacy, there were 30,000 people a night in shelter. Today, the number is pushing close to 100,000. About 70,000 of those are actually homeless New Yorkers. The other 30,000 are probably immigrants that have come into New York City, but it just says that you haven't handled the problem right in the past, and you need to do something different. If you keep doing the same things over and over and expecting a different result, we all know what that's the definition of. So I applaud Jessica. She has stepped down. Kind of sad. We have a big loss in New York City, but she's still a personal friend of mine at my disposal where I can always contact her and bounce ideas off of her. I will have to leave at the bottom of the hour, but Lydia has permission to take questions from me, and I always respond to Lydia and IGH with any answers that people may have from me personally in my lived experience. I do have to jump off at the bottom of the hour, and I apologize.
No, thank you, Rob, for that answer and for being with us today. The next question I'm going to send to Dr. Culhane. In your experience, what are the best practices for the collection of data on rural homelessness? Jayne, I just saw your hand, so we'll come back.
Yeah, rural homelessness tends to be among the sort of less visible types because people can live in makeshift dwellings, which may not be official housing, and so they're not intended as housing or habitation. So that makes it a little more difficult to track. But similarly, you have to sort of use the one night count method is the best way we have of trying to identify people in those circumstances, and it would require discussing with people who know the local environment, where they think these types of dwellings might be, and then deploying people out to do counts. And of course, it is seasonal. We have a big issue here in the United States. There's a summer unsheltered rural homeless population that develops in some of our federal parkland, and they're allowed to stay there, and they have to move every couple of weeks, but they are sometimes substantial groups. But it is a challenge because the rural areas are so much more geographically expansive. We do have a vendor here in the United States who has an app that is designed to assist with locating and filling out information associated with these folks. So that there is some technical support for that as well.
Thank you, Dennis. So getting a little more creative and expansive with how you're covering the geography and in particular talking with people who know that local geography really well and can help identify. Jayne, we'll come back to you. You had your hand up on the question about people with lived experience.
I just added to the Q&A.
Oh, perfect. Great, it's in the chat. Okay, a question has come in specifically for you, Lutendo, from John, who is in South Africa himself. So he's asking, what is stopping Statistics South Africa from implementing a more frequent data collection system? What are your challenges?
Well, our challenges are obvious finance. We've not had enough money to collect. We've not had that support from government yet. And I think with more we produce,
Yep,
am
we
I
got
off
you.
again?
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. The more we produce reports on this, I think we may get support, but we hope to get support because we've seen recently that there's a large call for this data and people really want to know what is there. They want to use it as a basis for planning or for starting programs. So therefore, I think the more we get support from our stakeholders like John and more, and we start making calls and saying there's need for this data, I think we also, as statistics say, we get confidence in terms of requesting data, or not data, money from our government. So
Thank you,
I
Lieutenant.
think that is our main problem.
So more resources and civil society and other stakeholders can help call for
Yes.
continued and expanded investments. Great.
Yes.
What are some concrete first steps and best practices that a United Nations member state can implement to collect actionable data? I'm going to send this one over to Gabrielle. What are some concrete steps that governments can do to collect data?
Creo que ahí lo más importante tiene que haber el poner el tema en agenda es importantísimo. A mí me parece que el rol que tiene este tipo de encuentros y el peso de la sociedad civil para poner el tema en agenda es importantísimo, porque muchas veces es uno de los últimos temas que se aborda en una agenda de gobierno, el tema del sinhogarismo, y ese es un gran problema. Me parece que cuando se logra eso y se logra entender que se puede generar una sinergia entre sociedad civil y el Estado, puede haber una diferencia. Y cuando logras eso, el Estado también hay que hacerlo entender que puede ser un coordinador y no necesariamente el único a la hora de abordar la problemática. Me parece que muchas veces existe como una barrera entre la sociedad civil y el Estado, que es el mayor desafío a romper o a superar. Desde ese lugar, nosotros cuando logramos poner ese tema en agenda y entender que se puede generar esa sinergia, es que los recursos desaparecen. Realmente, a la hora de pensar, nosotros en Uruguay somos un país en desarrollo, obviamente tenemos desafíos muy diferentes a los que pueden llegar a tener algunos de los otros países que están integrando este webinario o que integran este tipo de espacios. Tenemos problemas estructurales que llevan que hay una inestabilidad habitacional enorme comparado a lo que de repente pueden ser la situación de Estados Unidos o de algún otro de los países que acá participan. Pero me parece que cuando posicionamos el tema en agenda, logramos que los recursos puedan aparecer y termina siendo mucho más eficiente a la hora de invertir con información. Y me parece que ese es tener buenas experiencias y buenas prácticas vistas en otras partes del mundo, también puede ayudar a eso, a poder demostrar la eficiencia de la inversión cuando tenemos información.
Great. Thank you so much. We are now at time. Our 90 minutes has gone by so quickly. I want to say a really warm and sincere thanks to all of our panelists for being with us today, for all of the attendees who spent so much time with us today to engage in these thoughts and conversations and concepts. And I think it's clear that there is a rich learning community of people from around the world who are dealing with these questions and concepts on a daily basis. So it's just great to be with you all and sharing. So again, we will have the recording up within the next couple days. You'll get an email about it. So if you want to kind of watch back, and we just look forward to staying in touch with you. If you'd like to learn more and possibly join the UN NGO working group to end homelessness, I'll be putting that link into the chat here shortly as well. Thank you again, everyone, and have a really fantastic day. Take care. Thanks, everyone. Bye.